It will be noticed that my preparation for combat fighting in the air was a gradual one. As I look back upon it now, it seems that I had the rare good fortune to experience almost every variety of danger that can beset the war pilot before I ever fired a shot at an enemy from an airplane. This good fortune is rare, it appears to me. Many a better man than myself has leaped into his stride and begun accumulating victories from his very first flight over the lines. It was a brilliant start for him, and his successes brought him instant renown. But he had been living on the cream at the start, and was unused to the skim milk of aviation. One day the cream gave out, and the first dose of skim milk terminated his career. So despite the weeks and weeks of disappointment that attended my early fighting career, I appreciated even then the enormous benefit that I would reap later from these experiences. I can now most solemnly affirm that had I won my first victory during my first trips over the lines, I believe I would never have survived a dozen combats. Every disappointment that came to me brought with it an enduring lesson that repaid me eventually tenfold. If any one of my antagonists had been through the same school of disappointments that had so annoyed me, it is probable that he, instead of me, would now be telling his friends back home about his series of victories over the enemy. April in France is much like April anywhere else. Rains and cloudy weather appear suddenly out of a clear sky, and flying becomes out of the question, or very precarious at best. On the 29th of April, 1918, we rose at 6 o'clock and stuck our heads out of doors as usual for a hasty survey of a dismal sky. For the past 3 or 4 days it had rained steadily. No patrols had gone out from our aerodrome. If they had gone, they would not have found any enemy aircraft about, for none had been sighted from the lines along our sector. About noon the sun suddenly broke through and our hopes began to rise. I was slated for a patrol that afternoon, and from 3 o'clock on I waited at the hangars watching the steadily clearing sky. Captain Hall and I were to stand on alert until 6 o'clock that night at the aerodrome. Precisely at 5 o'clock, Captain Hall received a telephone call from the French headquarters at Beaumont, stating that an enemy two-seater machine had just crossed our lines and was flying south over their heads. Captain Hall and I had been walking about the field with our flying clothes on, and our machines were standing side by side with their noses pointed into the wind. Within the minute we had jumped into our seats and our mechanics were twirling the propellers. Just then the telephone sergeant came running out to us and told Captain Hall to hold his flight until the major was ready. He was to accompany us and would be on the field in 2 minutes. While the sergeant was delivering the message, I was scanning the northern heavens, and there I suddenly picked up a tiny speck against the clouds above the Forêt de la Reine, which I was convinced must be the enemy plane we were after. The major was not yet in sight. Our motors were smoothly turning over, and everything was ready. Pointing out the distant speck to Jimmy Hall, I begged him to give the word to go before we lost sight of our easy victim. If we waited for the major, we might be too late. To my great joy, Captain Hall acquiesced, and immediately ordered the boys to pull away the blocks from our wheels. His motor roared as he opened up his throttle, and in a twinkling, both our machines were running rapidly over the surface of the field. Almost side by side we arose, and climbing swiftly, soared away in a straight line after our distant Boche. In 5 minutes we were above our observation balloon line, which stretches along some 2 miles or so behind the front. I was on Jimmy's right wing, and off to my right, in the direction of Pont-à-Mousson, I could still distinguish our unsuspecting quarry. Try as I might, I could not induce the captain to turn in that direction, though I dipped my wings, darted away from him, and tried in every way to attract his attention to the target which was so conspicuous to me. He stupidly continued on straight north. I determined to sever relations with him and take on the Boche alone, since he evidently was generous enough to give me a clear field. Accordingly, I swerved swiftly away from Captain Hall, and within 5 minutes overhauled the enemy and adroitly maneuvered myself into an ideal position just under his sheltering tail. It was a large 3-seater machine, and a brace of guns poked their noses out to the rear over my head. With fingers closing on my triggers, I prepared for a dash upwards and quickly pulled back on my stick. Up I zoomed until my sights began to travel along the length of the fuselage overhead. Suddenly they rested on a curiously familiar-looking device. It was the French circular cocarde painted brightly under each wing. Up to this time I had not even thought of looking for its nationality, so certain had I been that this must be the Boche machine that had been sighted by the French headquarters. Completely disgusted with myself, I viraged abruptly away from my latest blunder, finding some little satisfaction in witnessing the startled surprise of the 3 Frenchmen aboard the craft, who had not become aware of my proximity until they saw me flash past them. At any rate, I stalked them successfully, and might have easily downed them if they had been Boche. But as it was, it would be a trifle difficult to face Jimmy Hall again and explain to him why I had left him alone to get myself 5 miles away under the tail of a perfectly harmless ally three-seater. I looked about to discover Jimmy's whereabouts. There he was, cavorting about the midst of a thick barrage of black shellbursts across the German lines. He was halfway to Saint-Mihiel and a mile or two inside Hun territory. Evidently he was waiting for me to discover my mistake and then overtake him, for he was having a delightful time with the Archie gunners, doing loops, barrels, side slips, and spins immediately over their heads to show them his contempt for them, while he waited for his comrade. Finally he came out of the Archie area with a long, graceful dive, and swinging up alongside my machine, he wiggled his wings as though he were laughing at me, and then suddenly he set a course back towards Pont-à-Mousson. Whether or not he knew all along that a German craft was in that region, I could not tell. But when he began to change his direction and curve up into the sun, I followed close behind him, knowing that there was a good reason for this maneuver. I looked earnestly about me in every direction. Yes, there was a scout coming towards us from north of Pont-à-Mousson. It was about at our altitude. I knew it was a Hun the moment I saw it, for it had the familiar lines of their new falls. Moreover, my confidence in James Norman Hall was such that I knew he couldn't make a mistake, and he was still climbing into the sun, carefully keeping his position between its glare and the oncoming fighting plane. I clung as closely to Hall as I could. The Hun was steadily approaching us, unconscious of his danger, for we were full in the sun. With the first downward dive of Jimmy's machine, I was by his side. We had at least 1,000 feet advantage over the enemy, and we were 2 to 1 numerically. He might outdive our machines, for the Falls is a famous diver, while our faster climbing Newport had a droll little habit of shedding their fabric when plunged too furiously through the air. The Boche hadn't a chance to outfly us. His only salvation would be in a dive towards his own lines. These thoughts passed through my mind in a flash, and I instantly determined upon my tactics. While Hall went in for his attack, I would keep my altitude and get a position on the other side of the falls to cut off his retreat. No sooner had I altered my line of flight than the German pilot saw me leave the sun's rays. Hall was already halfway to him when he stuck up his nose and began furiously climbing to the upper ceiling. I let him pass me and found myself on the other side just as Hall began firing. I doubt if the Boche had seen Hall's Newport at all. Surprised by discovering this new antagonist, Hall, ahead of him, the Falls immediately abandoned all idea of a battle, and banking around to the right, started for home, just as I had expected him to do. In a trice, I was on his tail. Down, down we sped with throttles both full open. Hall was coming on somewhere in my rear. The Boche had no heart for evolutions or maneuvers. He was running like a scared rabbit, as I had run from Campbell. I was gaining upon him every instant, and had my sights trained dead upon his seat before I fired my first shot. At 150 yards, I pressed my triggers. The tracer bullets cut a streak of living fire into the rear of the Fall's tail. Raising the nose of my airplane slightly, the fiery streak lifted itself like the stream of water pouring from a garden hose. Gradually it settled into the pilot's seat. The swerving of the Fall's course indicated that its rudder no longer was held by a directing hand. At 2,000 feet above the enemy's lines, I pulled up my headlong dive and watched the enemy machine continuing on its course. Curving slightly to the left, the Falls circled a little to the south, and the next minute crashed onto the ground just at the edge of the woods a mile inside their own lines. I had brought down my first enemy airplane and had not been subjected to a single shot. Hall was immediately beside me. He was evidently as pleased as I was over our success, for he danced his machine about in incredible maneuvers. And then I realized that old friend Archie was back on the job. We were not 2 miles away from the German anti-aircraft batteries, and they put up a furious bombardment of shrapnel all about us. I was quite ready to call it a day and go home, but Captain Hall deliberately returned to the barrage and entered it with me at his heels. Machine guns and rifle fire from the trenches greeted us, and I do not mind admitting that I got out quickly the way I came in, without any unnecessary delay. But Hall continued to do stunts over their heads for 10 minutes, surpassing all the acrobatics that the enraged Boche had ever seen even over their own peaceful aerodromes. Jimmy exhausted his spirits at about the time the Huns exhausted all their available ammunition, and we started blithely for home. Swooping down to our field side by side, we made a quick landing and taxied our victorious machines up to the hangars. Then jumping out, we ran to each other, extending glad hands for our first exchange of congratulations. And then we noticed that the squadron pilots and mechanics were streaming across the aerodrome towards us from all directions. They had heard the news while we were still dodging shrapnel, and were hastening out to welcome our return. The French had telephoned in a confirmation of my first victory before I had had time to reach home. Not a single bullet hole had punctured any part of my machine. There was a peculiar gratification in receiving the congratulations from one squadron for a victory in the air. It is worth more to a pilot than the applause of the whole outside world. It means that one has won the confidence of men who share the misgivings, the aspirations, the trials, and the dangers of airplane fighting. and with each victory comes a renewal and re-cementing of ties that bind together these brothers in arms. No closer fraternity exists in the world than that of the air fighters in this great war, and I have yet to find one single individual who has attained conspicuous success in bringing down enemy airplanes who can be said to be spoiled either by his successes or by the generous congratulations of his comrades. If he were capable of being spoiled, he would not have had the character to have won continuous victories. For the smallest amount of vanity is fatal in airplane fighting. Self-distrust, rather, is the quality to which many a pilot owes his protracted existence. It was with a very humble gratitude, then, that I received the warm congratulations of Lufbery, whom I had always revered for his 17 victories, of Doug Campbell and Alan Winslow, who had brought down the first machines that were credited to the American squadrons, and of many others of 94 Squadron, who had seen far more service in the battle areas than had I. I was glad to be at last included in the proud roll of victors of this squadron. These pals of mine were to see old 94 lead all American squadrons in the number of successes over the Huns. The following day I was notified that General Gerard, the commanding officer of the 6th French Army, had offered to decorate Captain Hall and myself in the name of the French government for our victory of the day before. We were then operating in conjunction with this branch of the French army. The Croix de Guerre with palm was to be accorded each of us, provided such an order met the approval of our own government. But at that time officers in the American army could not accept decorations from a foreign government, so the ceremony of presentation was denied us. Both Captain Hall and myself had been included, as such was the French rule where 2 pilots participated in a victory. The truth was that in the tense excitement of this first victory, I was quite blind to the fact that I was shooting deadly bullets at another aviator. And if I had been by myself, there was no doubt in my own mind but that I should have made a blunder again in some particular which would have reversed the situation. Captain Hall's presence, if not his actual bullets, had won the victory and had given me that wonderful feeling of self-confidence which made it possible for me subsequently to return to battle without him and handle similar situations successfully.